Hello and welcome to Cherry Bekaert's Industrial Podcast. My name is Matt Brady and I'm Cherry Bekaert's Industrial Industry Leader. Thank you all for joining us today. I know we have a combination of clients, friends of the firm, and non-clients, so potential future clients. So we appreciate you joining. Here at Cherry Bekaert, our goal is to do more than just the core compliance of items like tax returns and audited financial statements, other accounting advisory matters. Really, our goal is to also expand and provide proactive advice. So for us, that can include items and segments within our advisory service line, like digital transformation, new market tax credits, transaction advisory, buy side, sell side. It certainly covers a lot of things that I would include in today, which is strategic tax advisory. So items like SALT, international tax, R&D credits, accounting method matters, cost segregations, and advice around legislation, including today's overview on the CHIPS Act. And I will note today is an overview. We do have 3 trailing podcasts that will go a little bit deeper into each of the aspects of the CHIPS Act. So with that, without further delay, I will introduce my partner, Ron Wainwright. Ron is a partner in our strategic tax advisory group and has definitely taken a deep dive into the legislation passed August 9th. And so with that, Ron, happy to have you here today.
Fantastic, Matt. Thank you, and appreciate our listeners listening in to this first of 4 podcasts. My name is Ron Wainwright. I'm a strategic tax partner. I've been a partner at Cherry Bekaert 12 plus years, but prior to that, I was a tax partner for 14 years with one of the mega firms. And so look forward to the discussion today in regards to the CHIPS and Innovation Act of 2022.
Yeah, and Ron, I know, as I noted, and certainly as we've discussed, so we're gonna try to take some bite sizes of this in some trailing podcasts. But let's today we'll try to keep it high level and an overview. So if you could give us a little bit more background or maybe some initial observations on the CHIPS Act.
Yeah, great, Matt. Thank you. So first of all, when we refer to the CHIPS Act, technically, it is what is referred to as the Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors, a la CHIPS Act, and its technical term is the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022. It was passed by the Senate on July 27th on a 64-33 approval. And so you can see immediately that it is bipartisan. The House picked it up on July 28th and passed it 243 to 187, with 24 Republicans voting yes. So again, a bipartisan piece of legislation. And then President Biden signed the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022 on August 9th. At a very high level, the CHIPS Act is to be considered as part of a broader U.S. competitiveness legislation, specifically with respect to the semiconductor industry. And we'll talk in more detail as to what is in the CHIPS Act during this podcast.
No, that's great. Yeah, Ron, and certainly always, I think we can all agree when we have bipartisan legislation, that's positive for the economy, positive for the country. So, and for any of us who have, all of us who've lived through the recent supply chain concerns and issues that have arisen post-COVID, semiconductors and all that come with that, certainly we understand how that impacts the industry. So why is this bill so important, and in particular, maybe the semiconductor aspects to our industrial clients?
So great question, Matt. So let me make an observation and then an action item for our listeners. So the CHIPS legislation seeks to promote increased U.S. domestic manufacturing of semiconductors to ultimately address the supply chain issues and actually national security concerns. An action item for our listeners is the semiconductor industry and businesses that rely on industrial industry products will want to analyze the new federal funding and the tax incentives which occurred through the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022, to ultimately promote increased domestic semiconductor manufacturing. And I would say that all industrial clients or stakeholders should really pay attention to this legislation, because there is a lot in there when we think about, first of all, the semiconductor subsidies as well as grants and loan guarantees that ultimately will support the increased production, i.e. manufacturing, significant job creation and investments in the United States. And so to your question, why are semiconductors important? Semiconductors, such as the electrical circuit wafers that you see when you open up your computer, though they are often very small, are at the heart of much of modern technology, including smartphones and TVs and digital cameras and LED bulbs and our ATMs and medical equipment and cars. So you get the picture. We use them every day without thinking about it. The issue the CHIPS and Science Act addresses is considering how ubiquitous semiconductors are in both industry and our everyday lives of the regular people in the United States. We in the United States produce a relatively small percentage of them. As many as a quarter of all semiconductors produced globally are made in China. About 90% of the most advanced semiconductors are produced by one Taiwanese company, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And overall, about 75% of all semiconductors are produced in East Asia. Other countries with growing production include Germany and the Netherlands. And so by contrast, only about 12% of modern semiconductor manufacturing is actually happening in the US. And candidly, that number has dropped significantly from 37% during the 1990s. As we all can imagine, this economic and political implication is a threat to the United States, and therefore the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022. As also many of us know, the world's largest chip manufacturers, including Intel and NVIDIA, are actually U.S. companies that are primarily manufacturing in Asia, Europe, and other parts of the world. And so, from a background perspective, with the passage of the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022, there are significant grants and subsidies and a new credit, which we'll talk about, around the manufacturing, advanced manufacturing credit to the semiconductor equipment to really ensure that we shift back to the United States the manufacturing of semiconductors on a global basis, specifically prior to 2026. So it's pretty exciting legislation when you think about it, but that gives some background in regards to why it's important in regards to the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022.
Yeah, Ron, that certainly speaks to the intent of the legislation, and that is the reshoring or onshoring. A couple of different ways we could think about that, but really self-reliance on other countries we can obviously improve. So that's fantastic, and I think that maybe leads us to. I don't want to give you a two-part question, but I think it might lead to two different aspects that we could now delve into. And one is okay, now we understand the intent. So what's the tax policy that's going to support that intent? And then secondarily, what's the funding, or at least the high-level overview of that funding that's contained within the bill that's going to incentivize companies to support in this effort?
Sure. So, let's kind of go back to the intent piece, which is ultimately the tax policy side of it. And so when you think about scientific research and development, or R&D, above and beyond the research and development credit that's in the United States, it ultimately is critical to economic development and public health and national defense. With as much as 85% of U.S. productivity growth really in the first half of the 20th century resulting from technological advances. And these advances came through, partnerships and technology handoffs, really between the federal government and the private sector, and have contributed much to the United States' success. For instance, as an example, federally funded curiosity-driven research created the knowledge underlying the GPS, or the Global Positioning System. Further, atomic clocks and cancer drugs and web browsers and barcodes and speech recognition technology and 3D printing. So obviously, when we talk about, kind of competition on a global basis, increased global technology competition has surfaced as economic and national security concerns, with other nations competing with the United States, announcing plans to really assume that global leadership in key economics and national security technologies, specifically such as artificial intelligence and some of the microelectronics that we're seeing. So to my point earlier, the U.S. federal R&D spending as a percentage of GDP is now at its lowest point in over 60 years. And total U.S. R&D spending as a percentage of GDP has fallen from fourth place in the 90s to the ninth place on a global basis, behind advanced economies such as China and South Korea and Japan and Germany. So again, the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022 is intended to reverse these trends. And the act, as we'll refer to it, authorizes in dollar terms, the largest 5-year investment in public research and development in the nation's history. This investment would grow what's often referred to as the curiosity-driven and translation research to really drive the United States back to hopefully a position of number one in the world. So ultimately, the act will invest $39 billion over 5 years to expand domestic semiconductor manufacturing. It will provide companies incentives to build, expand, and modernize U.S. facilities and equipment. I mentioned that the act also creates a new 25% credit, tax credit for companies that invest in semiconductor manufacturing equipment or the construction of manufacturing facilities. Further, private companies will receive financial assistance that will ultimately be restricted from expanding certain chip manufacturing into China for 10 years. And so this act has also been referred to as the America Competes Act against China. There's also another $1.5 billion that will fund what's referred to as the Public Wireless Supply Chain Innovation Fund. And this will help communication companies compete with Chinese telecom giants such as Huawei and limit the scope of other telecommunication companies within close ties to China. So there's also millions of dollars of workforce development to make sure workers are available to support more advanced manufacturing in the United States. Now, it is interesting, and we'll do a deeper dive in this in another podcast, but the majority of the funding will funnel through two government agencies, the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy's Office of Science. And further, there are some investments that will ultimately create a National Science Foundation Directorate for Technology and Innovation and partnerships to accelerate American developments and technologies, as I mentioned, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, advanced manufacturing, 6G communications, and then ultimately energy and material science. And there also is going to be federal funding that will create a new regional technology hubs across the United States, which ultimately will strengthen small manufacturers as well as reduce long-term supply chain vulnerabilities in areas such as advanced manufacturing and next-generation communications and computer hardware and pharmaceuticals. So you can see through that background, there is a significant investment over the next 5 years, really through 2026, to really accelerate our ability to manufacture through these grants and subsidies and credits, semiconductors in the United States.
So Ron, I know we're you mentioned it briefly, and I know we're going to cover it in a trailing podcast, but can you maybe speak specifically to the new advanced manufacturing credit? I know many of our listeners are well, we'd hope, are taking advantage of credits such as the R&D credit and other tax credits that have been in legislation longer. But maybe give a sneak preview on what that new advanced manufacturing credit contained in this bill is.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. So beyond the grants and the funding within the industrial sector, there is a new advanced manufacturing investment tax credit. And so the CHIPS Act would create this new but temporary 25% advanced manufacturing investment credit for investments in semiconductor manufacturing property. The credit would include and does include incentives for the manufacturing of semiconductors and specialized tooling equipment, which is required in the semiconductor manufacturing process. Ultimately, those eligible industrial companies also can elect to treat the credit as a payment against tax, or what's referred to as a direct pay, as well as the credit provisions include various kind of special rules, as they're referred to. And so the credit will apply for property that's placed in service after December 31st, 2022, for which construction begins prior to January 1 of 2027. And so you can see this new temporary, though, advanced manufacturing investment tax credit is a substantial benefit to those industrial clients and those potential industrial clients that will ultimately begin to manufacture not only semiconductors, but the specialized tooling equipment, which is required. So again, to an earlier comment, a significant shift away from the, quote, 75+% of manufacturing that's occurring offshore, but really to shift it back in to the United States. One aspect I did not mention, but I would like to, is that when you think about the CHIPS bill, it's a total of $52.7 billion for chip manufacturing and research. However, within the act, the CHIPS Act also authorizes roughly $200 billion in new funding to promote U.S. research programs and research and development and workforce development. Now, it is authorized and it will require future action by Congress, and we'll talk further about that in a subsequent podcast. But we can say succinctly that as part of the current appropriations bill, that the House and Senate are currently considering for the government's 2023 fiscal year, which begins October 1st of 2022, there is much discussion about not only the $52.7 billion that's already been appropriated that will be deployed, but further a large portion of that $200 billion that is authorized currently. So, a lot of really exciting news out there for our industrial taxpayers and clients.
Yeah, and Ron, I think what you've covered today from an overview perspective probably only whets the appetite of our listeners, and to the extent they want to hear more about, and I'll go in reverse order here, the advanced manufacturing credit, certainly the funding aspects of the bill, and then, the American manufacturing credit and the production credit. So there's a lot of incentives to support, which is important here in this move and shift to move that semiconductor production back to the U.S. and incentivize that. And I think that's important to many of our listeners. And we recognize, the bill was only passed 13 days ago, so still very new. And that's why we wanted to attempt to be, if not the first, at least near the forefront of those sharing information on this bill. And like we shared, we'll take a deeper dive into a few aspects of it. So Ron, really appreciate the overview today. For our listeners, we hope this was extremely helpful, and know that there will be three more, and we'll take deeper dives into this, and hopefully have the opportunity to share more, not just generally, but specifically with you and your business. So thank you again, Ron. Really appreciate you being on today.
No, thank you, Matt. And we'll look forward to the three additional podcasts where we'll take deeper dives into the advanced manufacturing credit. We'll also take a deeper dive into the funding, the specific funding that's contained within the CHIPS Act, and how industrial taxpayers can take advantage of that funding, of grants and loans and other programs. And then ultimately, we'll take a deeper dive into the advanced manufacturing credit coupled with the manufacturing production credit, which was passed is in the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. So a lot of good news for our industrial clients and taxpayers, and we'll look forward to those subsequent podcasts.
Yeah, well, Ron, thank you to all our listeners. Thank you for your time, and hope you listen into our next podcast.